Will Iran's regime survive the strike of Israel that is about to come, at least according to rumors? In this video, we are going to talk about the likely targets, the difficulties, and the potential consequences of the coming Israeli strike against Iran. Now, before we go into the details, allow me a disclaimer. We are basing a lot of this on rumors. There have been a lot of explanations, a lot of declarations, and a ton of rumors, but what we do not have is security, a certainty what is actually going to happen. It seems to be almost 100% certain that Israel will strike Iran. When it got attacked with over 200 ballistic missiles, it was obvious that Israel cannot allow Iran to do this without any repercussions. That does not mean we do know that it's going to happen within the next 3 to 5 days, even though the rumors are currently in this regard. This does also not mean to which extent the strike against Iran will happen. Supposedly, the attack is about to come, so it would be within this week, but we'll have to see how much of this is true. But as said, a lot of the claims are always indirectly. They are by some former military, they are by some second-level military, they are by some unnamed officials, etc., etc. For instance, we have a quote from a former brigadier general of the Israelis who said this is going to be the beginning of a war that is going to last for many, many months, but that doesn't mean it's a guarantee that he's right. Supposedly also there have been threats made by Iran towards other nations should they allow Israel to use its airspace for strikes against Iran, should they participate, or should they help Israel defend against Iranian attacks. There have been a lot of threats like this that were spread around, but we have seen that there were no consequences whatsoever. Jordan helped Israel defeat the attacks against its territory, and there have not been any strikes against Jordan territory as a repercussion. Now, that doesn't mean that the fact that we had threats and that they have not been fulfilled doesn't mean that nothing is going to happen. But while we have a lot of speculation, we do know one thing almost for certain. Netanyahu wants to crush the Iranian nuclear program. He has been in front of the United Nations a lot of times in the past, showing how close Iran is to the nuclear bomb. Israel feels threatened in its pure existence by a country that always proclaims it wants to wipe Israel off the map. And a country like that should it have nuclear weapons, it would obviously be a serious threat to its national security. But we have to say, while Netanyahu wants to strike the nuclear program, that is far from certain that it's going to happen, because without the help of the United States, this will be extremely difficult. The United States, on the other hand, do not want rising oil prices, both for domestic reasons, then for international economic reasons that will have an effect on the US economy, and obviously for reasons of the war in Ukraine, as Russia would massively profit from a spike in oil prices. So strikes on oil facilities are not in the interest of the United States either. Neither is a next big Gulf war. These are the facts that we more or less know as of now. Iran, according to estimates of Western experts, has roughly 3,000 ballistic missiles, but a lot of them are not having the range to strike Israel. So Iran is probably able to do a few more attacks on Israel, but that would be it. After that, the rest of their missile arsenal will only be able to strike oil fields and oil facilities in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar, so in other Gulf states, but not against Israel. They could also obviously strike US facilities in those countries. Israel has an air force that will allow it to strike conventionally inside of Iran. Potentially, they could also use cruise missiles from their submarines, or they could use ballistic missiles. The Jericho 2 that they have reaches western Iran, and supposedly it can carry conventional warheads. That was at least said in the literature in the past. The Jericho 3 is intercontinental, so it can strike Iran everywhere. And while it's understood to be a nuclear weapon, to carry only nuclear warheads, that doesn't mean it will be limited to it. It is very likely that it can carry conventional warheads as well if the Israelis are interested in doing so. This does not mean, though, that missiles are going to be the do-all, can-all option for Israel, as the arsenal that Israel has in these missile types is likely very limited. So it will be enough for a small number of attacks, but definitely not to do a longer campaign. To do a longer campaign, Israel will need aid. It will need the right to fly over Jordan or Saudi Arabia, or it will have Russia ignore it flying over Syria and Iraq to have it ignore as well. So those are the difficulties. Initially, in a short strike, it's quite possible that they either fly over Syria or over Saudi Arabia without either doing anything. But if it continues, if it's a week-long, a month-long campaign, at some point that will cause some problems, and the governments will have to take a stance in this regard. So it will need a cooperation, or at least a willful ignorance, a continued willful ignorance of those governments. Also, they will need aid from the United States, both in munitions as well as in tanking capabilities. While they do have some aerial tankers, they are far from being enough to allow the Israeli Air Force to do a continuous strike campaign against Iran. And the ammunition storages are limited, especially with a whole lot of targets inside of Iran, and at the same time a lot of ammunitions being expended in Gaza as well as in Lebanon. Whether the US will participate itself or only with weapon deliveries and tanker planes is uncertain, but in either case it means that the US aid will be necessary for a longer campaign if it's not just a 1 or 2 day strike. Without US help, though, fighting against Iran will be very difficult for Israel if this is supposed to be a longer campaign. Now let's talk about the potential targets. We basically have 4 more or less categories. We have the oil industry, we have the nuclear facilities, we have military targets. That means IRGC as well as regular military, so the Revolutionary Guard Corps and military, as well as the facilities being not just airfields, ports, etc., but also the armaments facilities, the production facilities, where, for instance, drones and the missiles are being produced. And finally, we have the option of striking leadership targets inside of Iran. Let's start off with the nuclear facilities. Iran has enriched its nuclear so far that it can reach weapon-grade uranium concentration of uranium-235 within a very short time. It was in the past says it's 2 weeks or less until Iran has enriched uranium enough for nuclear weapons. So far, from the understanding that is worldwide, Iran has not done that step, and the reason for that is simple. If Iran takes that step, decides to go for nuclear weapons, it has a window where it is in extreme danger. That's the window where they started to work on nuclear weapons until the nuclear weapons become operational. In that time frame, if Iran gets found out, if the Israeli spies report that Iran does that step, a military strike is almost certain, whereas Iran has invited that strike and has provoked it by trying to go for the nuclear weapon. It cannot deter against that strike because the nuclear weapon is not there. So Iran would have to race towards a nuclear bomb while the sword of Damocles is swinging above their head, able to hit them at all time. And this is likely the reason why Iran has not done the step to go for nuclear weapons. In this context, it's much smarter for Iran to prepare everything, to make the time as short as possible to go for nuclear weapons, but not to do them, not to go that step, because during that time, they are not being threatened with a full attack yet, and they do not face the same international repercussions as if they would try to go for the nuclear weapons. So for Iran, it's the smartest way possible. The difficulties in striking those is, though, that Iran has a lot of facilities. The majority or a big part of them are deep underground. They have built the facilities except specifically to prevent them being struck by Israel or the United States. And a lot of the facilities are not on the coast, but deeper inland, which means that whatever is coming to attack them, be it planes, be it cruise missiles, has to fly over Iranian territory, increasing the chance of interception and thus making it difficult and potentially more casualty prone to strike those targets. Also, the targets are heavily protected with air defense and potentially the Air Force, but that doesn't mean that an attack on them would be impossible, as Israel has proven with its demonstrative strike against an air defense system in the past. After the initial strike of the Iranians, Israel there struck a air defense radar with a air-launched ballistic missile without a warhead, demonstrating to Iran what they can do without forcing a further escalation. So an attack on the nuclear facilities is possible without the United States for Israel, but it's far less prone to success, as the Israelis will have big trouble hitting the underground facilities, as they simply don't have the ammunition to do that in one go. Those are usually only in the capabilities only on the US side from B-2 bombers, where they can launch the deep penetration, the heavy bombs that the Israelis neither have nor can they launch them from their own planes. So without the US, they would have a much harder time striking the nuclear power plants. And even if other Arab states help them, for instance, Saudi Arabia is not interested in Iran getting the nuclear weapon, even then Israel will have a problem hitting those tunnels, whether it's direct Saudi Arabian support with its Air Force, which is far less likely than, for instance, the Saudis allowing them to refuel, giving them emergency airfields in case of damage, etc., etc. In the moment of the attack, as soon as the strikes against the nuclear facilities begin, it's expected that Iran will race towards the nuclear weapons, basically following the rule, use it or lose it. If they don't use their facilities to gain nuclear weapons, they might no longer have the facilities a week later. So in that moment, the moment Israel starts striking the nuclear facilities, we can expect that Iran will run to try to get the bomb as fast as possible. And there, obviously, it will have a big impact whether the US helps them or not, whether the Iranians can be prevented from gaining the bomb before it's too late. So the attack on the nuclear facilities has been so substantial that Iran will not get the bomb despite it being attacked, despite it having the highly enriched uranium already, and it has to stop it to prevent it from racing towards the bomb. Israel is talking about almost 2 decades about the Iranian nuclear program, and they want to destroy it. There's no question about it. It was stopped several times already by the US. Several governments already made the initiative, took the initiative, trying to destroy the nuclear facilities, but they were stopped by the United States. Now, on the other hand, would be the perfect opportunity. The US president is not able to stop Israel. Israel has the moral high ground from their point after the massacre of October 7th, and all of this will allow them to take a chance now that they might otherwise not have. But in total, if we look at the difficulties and the risks, I do not think this is the likely result, because as said, without massive US help, it would probably be a very bad idea, and that Joe Biden gives that help at this moment seems extremely unlikely. Now let's talk about military targets. Both within the regular military as well as within the IRGC, so the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the defense production. Attack on military headquarters, on air defense, on airfields, on factories, on weapon storage, on logistics would be in that ballpark. The option, the aim for that strike would be that it creates a deterrence towards Iran, that it weakens Iran, and that it takes away capabilities from Iran. In general, an attack on the missile production facilities and the drone production facilities wouldn't just help Israel defend against, weaken Iran and help Israel that Iran has less weapons to strike them in the future, but it would also help Ukraine as Russia is receiving drones from those factories, and as Russia has received short-range ballistic missiles from those factories. In this case, the Israelis wouldn't just weaken Iran, they would also make the US happy. So this is a big argument for strikes on targets like this. This attack is doable, and if it's strong enough, it will make Iran weaker. Iran will not be the same danger for several years, maybe even longer, but it's all dependent on the destruction and on the intensity of the attacks. That's obvious. So in total, this is a likely target, and a target that offers fairly little risk in regards to other options. So this would be a likely aim, a likely path that the Iranians will face from the Israelis that the Israelis will go. The next option would be strikes against the leadership. Ali Khamenei is very old and his succession is not made. We do not have, there is no clear successor to Ali Khamenei, even though he's clearly reaching the end of his lifespan. It was expected that Ebrahim Raisi is going to follow him as a spiritual leader within Iran, but he died in a helicopter crash earlier this year. So the likely successor of Ali Khamenei was taken out of the game. Right now, it's unclear who's going to follow him. Khamenei will likely want to make his own son his successor, but there is massive internal opposition against this because it would also look like he's establishing a dynasty in this regard. Should Khamenei be killed by the Israelis, it might cause a leadership crisis inside of Iran. The support for the regime is already weakened. The city population in majority wants freedom and doesn't want that government. And they also have an economic crisis where while they spend billions on international terrorist organizations, increasing the dissatisfaction within the population. So the weakening of the leadership, not just by the killing of Khamenei, but also within the military, within the other political leadership, within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, could allow for the population to rise up against a less organized leadership, a less organized government. Oil. Iran is exporting almost everything over the island of Khark. Khark is in the western Persian Gulf, and it is in the past, I found data, whereas 98% of all oil exported was exported over that island. The Iranians have had attempts to set up a second harbor behind the Strait of Hormuz to allow for export, but from everything I found, there is no possibility to export from there yet. So this one island, if it's taken out, it would mean that for months Iran would simply be impossible. It would be impossible for Iran to export any significant amount of oil. And this is doable with a strike, probably with a single strike, which would also be the least dangerous for Israel itself. Israel is the closest to this island. The air defense is limited, as it can only work from the shore of Iran itself and from the island itself, but everything approaching to it from the ocean itself, from the Persian Gulf, is not flying over Iranian air defense itself, which means the defense is much, much lower that Israel would face in this regard. Also, potentials for the Iranians to react with their own air force is very limited, and while those air force is obsolete, it doesn't mean that it's useless or it can't do any danger. It is completely harmless to the Israelis. They still would have to expect being shot at, and they still would have to react to this. But if they come from the other side of the Persian Gulf, maybe even in F-35, the chance of the Iranian Air Force to react to that is close to zero. So a success in a strike against Khark is almost guaranteed. We could also imagine strikes against refineries, against storage facilities, maybe pumping stations for pipelines, and even the oil fields itself could be struck. But all of those are with less likelihood going down the list that I just mentioned. So obviously, striking oil fields is the least likely target for the Israelis. The risk there, if they strike the oil fields, is that Iran can close the Strait of Hormuz. That would stop the export of oil from the Persian Gulf. It can be fought open. There can be naval forces opening the strait against Iranian resistance, but it would be really expensive. It would need permanent escorts for every oil tanker there. Mines would have to be swept all the time, and it would be likely that harbors and coastal positions in Iran would have to be struck to prevent small boats charging out, attacking oil tankers, laying fresh mines, and obviously anti-ship missiles being launched from the shore itself. So while it is possible to guard tankers to a certain degree, it's A, not 100% successful, and B, it would be fairly costly. All of this obviously leading to higher oil prices in this regard as well. Then the Strait of Hormuz, though, that Iran will close it in case of a war is not 100% certainty, because the moment Iran closes it, it itself can no longer export. That means that when the strait is closed, Iran loses all its foreign revenue, all the income through its oil sales. And this means that if Iran can no longer export oil, then is the likelihood that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed. But as long as Iran itself is capable of exporting, as long as Iran is still exporting, closure of the Strait of Hormuz is fairly unlikely at this point. If it comes to this, if Iranian oil is struck, it might consider striking the Saudi oil production. Again, rumors said that they threatened this actually. I have not seen anything that I would consider worth quoting or where I would say this is definitely Iranian position, but at least supposedly they threatened that they would attack the other oil production around the Gulf. This would obviously lead to a weakening of these countries and to a loss in revenue there, but we have to say those threats have been spread around and around in the past without them leading to something, without them following up, without Iran following up to it at any point. First of all, if Iran's oil facilities are struck, there is no more Iranian oil export. If Iran does what they threatened, it would be a reduced oil export by the other nations. It would lead, from what I found, there is only one operating pipeline from the Persian Gulf towards the Red Sea. That's the Saudi pipeline that has a capacity of 5 million barrels, but that's it. No oil from the UAE, no oil from Bahrain, from Kuwait, from Qatar, is likely going to be exported, which would reduce the available oil on the world market, not just by the Iranian one, but also by the rest from the western shore of the Persian Gulf, except for those 5 million barrels that the Saudis might be able to pump to the other side. And I say might here for a reason, as obviously those pumping stations are known and can be attacked and can be taken out, stopping this export at least for the time being. A US president, on the other hand, could react to the oil price shock that would then come by stopping the exports. He has the legal authority to do this now. As the US is currently producing more than they are currently needing, this should lead to an actual price drop in the US, meaning that the US consumer would be able to buy cheaper oil, but the oil that would no longer be exported would be missing on the world market as well, which would lead to even higher oil prices. Iran would follow on a situation like this would threaten the stability of the regimes around the Gulf, obviously, if they run out of money, at least if that prolongs. Iran itself would have complete economic collapse in front of it. They are already under financial stress right now, and without oil revenue, they would be in much, much bigger trouble. And China is importing the vast majority of its oil from the region. So if nothing is coming more there and the prices rises to unheard heights, they would be in trouble seriously as well. So let's talk about if we want to talk about how likely each strike is, we need to understand first the intention that the Israelis might have. And there might be three potential things that Israel might aim for this strike. First is to punish Iran. Second is to weaken Iran, or third is to change the regime. To punish Iran, they wouldn't need massive strikes. They would just have to inflict enough pain that there is a recreated deterrence towards Iran. That Iran knows, it's not a good idea to strike Israel. They hurt us more than we hurt them. That's the basic principle of deterrence. And for that, they don't need to cover Iran with a campaign over weeks and over months. And this time, though, we have to expect a much harsher strike than last time, where, as said, they used one, from the reports, they used one inert air-launched ballistic missile without a warhead just to strike a radar, showing the Iranians, A, we can hit you, B, we can hit your air defense, and we can hit it so accurately that we don't even need warheads. That was an effective show of force, but obviously not effective enough to deter Iran from continuing. So this time it would be kinetic. Those missiles would carry explosives, and the strikes would cause damage inside of Iran to a bigger degree. But if it's just about a punishment, the bombing campaign would not last weeks and months. It would likely be shorter, and it would be very unlikely that the nuclear program would be struck because of the reasons I said before. This requires a much bigger effort, and the moment the strikes against the nuclear program start, that's the moment where the Iranians race towards the bomb. So in this case, if it's just about punishment, the nuclear program will likely not be touched. An attack on Khark is risky. So I would guess if it's just about punishment, they would focus on the military, the leadership, and the defense industry, and maybe some refineries and some storage facilities, but not Khark itself, as this would cause, as said, the oil price shock, which would make the US very unhappy, which would strengthen Russia, which would make the US even more unhappy, which would make, in case of closure of the Hormuz Strait, would annoy the Arab regimes against Israel. So in this regard, striking refineries, that means that less fuel is available in Iran, that the Iranians can no longer export refined fuels, and that the fuel prices inside of Iran rise. That's a good thing for Israel, but that's not something which leaves no choice to Iran but to strike back in full. So I would guess if it's just about punishment, Khark and the oil program will not be touched. The nuclear program is an option, but it's only really realistic with the US aid. The nuclear program has to be destroyed to a full scale. They can't just do it halfway. If they do it, they need to do it till the end, and they just a little is not a possibility for the reasons stated. Otherwise, Iran will race towards the bomb and probably achieve it. So if it's about weakening, if the US help, they'll go for the nuclear program. That's the likely thing, but they, as said, the likely thing for them to achieve it, they would need US help and probably US kinetic help, so B-2 bombers striking those facilities, for instance. So the more likely targets for weakening would be the industry, the leadership, the military, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, close to punishment, but just in a bigger scale. And this time oil is a much more likely target, as without oil, Iran has no money for war. It has no money to prop up its economy, and thus it's weakening its own economy, and it's weakening its own abilities to do Israel harm. Khark, in this context, is a much more likely target, but the other Arab states could be pulled into it, and that might be a reason for Israel to not do it. But as said, if it's about weakening Iran in the longer term, then hitting Khark Island is a good idea. Iran, in this case, will definitely not sit it out. In this case, I would expect Iran to strike back with whatever they have. So the escalation there would lead to a bigger strike campaign, as obviously Israel would feel forced to strike back against Iranian strikes until the Iranians have run out of missiles. So this would not be a thing for a day or two. This will probably last weeks in this regard. This would be the most permanent solution. Obviously, Israel had good relationships with the Empire of Persia, with the Empire of Iran, when the Shah was still ruling. The relationships deteriorated only after the change in leadership, after the Mullah regime came to power. If this Mullah regime is gotten rid of, then the relationships between the two countries might take a U-turn. The regime is not supported by the majority of the population. That's at least from everything you read out of Iran. But we have to say it still is the controller of the armed forces, and not just the military, but also the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Basij, and other militias. So the regime has the guns basically, whereas the population might be bigger but does not have guns. Beheading strikes, taking out leadership, in this case, if it's for regime change, would be very likely, not just against military and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but also against political persons. So not just the Ayatollah, but also against the president, maybe against members of parliament, against other government offices, against ministries, etc. Because this would reduce the organization and the effectiveness of any potential response of the Iranian regime against an uprising by its people. So whenever you take out leadership, everything below it is less organized afterwards, and thus it would help that the population might overthrow the government. It would also lead to a succession crisis, as said before, and this would also harm the unity within the regime's forces if Israel takes out the Ayatollah and maybe even his potential successors. We've seen it in their attacks against Hezbollah, where they've taken out one after the other. If they do something like this in Iran, this will obviously cause significant problems within the leadership of the Iranian regime. Then oil attacks would let the economy collapse. If they take out Khark Island, if they take out the refineries, Iran's economy is in even bigger trouble than it already is. It's basically done. This would lead to not just those who don't support the regime to go on the streets, but probably also those who got poor because of this, those who can live with the regime as long as they have food on the table. At that point, they stop having food on the table, so they get mad as well. And this would be much more likely, this would turn it much more likely for the Iranian regime to fall in this regard. But we have to say, in a fight for its existence, the regime will show no restraint whatsoever. So the repercussions, both domestically, both against other potential opponents within the Gulf, and both against US and Israel, would be without any limits when it comes to the regime itself. And here it is, like it always is, the higher the risk, the higher the potential reward. So those are the options that I see currently, what Israel might strike, what might be their motivation, and what are the consequences of this. What do you think? Do you think I missed something? Write it in the comment section, and write it in the comment section. What do you think are the likely aims that Israel is actually going to do against Iran? If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel and my fat boy here, then you can use the links in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.